The Mexico City Grand Prix is over and there is a new championship leader as Lando Norris took the lead in the Drivers' Championship. But now F1 is moving from Mexico to Brazil for the Brazilian Grand Prix, which means that once again it is time for my preview and predictions. This is a series that I'll be previewing, and then at the end of the video giving out my early predictions for the Grand Prix. If you enjoy the video then please hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. And when you finish with this video, please remember to check out the latest episode of Crash Happy, which you can find in the description below. But now, let's get into the video. As usual, I'll be talking about the top teams later on, so please do stick around for that. Yep, F1 is back at Interlagos for the Brazilian Grand Prix, and the F1 Championship is continuing to close up between the top three drivers, as Lando Norris took the lead of the Drivers' Championship from his teammate Oscar Piastri and leads by the most slender of margins. Just 1 point separates the two McLaren drivers, and the Brazilian Grand Prix is another sprint weekend, meaning that the teams and drivers have just the one practice session to get things right before they head into sprint qualifying on Friday. And then on Saturday, they will have the sprint race followed by Grand Prix qualifying, and of course the main race on Sunday. As of me writing this video, it is looking like we are in for a rain-affected weekend, just like we saw last season in 2024, as there is a lot of heavy rain in the region currently. This means that we may see a chaos-filled weekend, like we saw last season, and we will see yet another wet race weekend in 2025, where pretty much anything could happen. Brazil is another race at higher altitude than normal, however it is only just 700 meters above sea level instead of over 2 kilometers like it was in Mexico, meaning that the cars will still be suffering, but they won't be suffering as much as what we saw in Mexico. The circuit is in general a fan favourite, and it typically delivers great races. The circuit provides a real challenge, as the circuit features some long straights which require good speed, but also some corners which require great downforce and grip, mainly at the infield section. The teams do need to get their compromise right straight away, or it could be a pretty tricky weekend for them. In terms of the tyres for the 2025 Brazilian Grand Prix, Pirelli has opted to take a completely different route to what we have seen generally so far this season, and that is Pirelli has gone a step harder on all compounds compared to last season, meaning that the hard tyre is the C2 tyre, the medium is the C3, and the soft is the C4. And for me, that is a bit of a surprise. Generally, so far this season, we've seen the tyres hang on quite a bit longer than what we saw last season, so Pirelli going a step harder is a bit disappointing if it is a dry weekend. The reason that they've done this is because they thought that last year the soft tyres just didn't hang on well enough, but given the tyres are stronger this year, you would have thought that really they could have got away with those softer compounds. Last year in the Grand Prix, there was a total of 33 pit stops. However, as you can see, it was only the wets and intermediates that were used, because, well, it wasn't dry enough for any dry running. And if the race is dry, I expect that we will potentially see a multi-stop race where they use the soft and medium tyres, because once again, I do think the hard tyres are going to be just a little bit too hard for this weekend. Overtaking at Brazil is generally very possible and pretty easy. It is a great track for racing, and you can see that as last year there was 43 on-track overtakes. To help with overtaking, the Interlagos circuit features 2 DRS zones. The first DRS zone is down the pit straight heading towards turn 1, and the second DRS zone is on the exit of the S's, on the run down the Retroposta towards the Descenda del Lago, otherwise known as Turn 4. Given the amount of rain expected, we might not see much DRS action, but we should see a good amount of on-track overtaking as the drivers are struggling for grip in the rainy conditions. Last year, the pole position lap time was set by Lando Norris in the McLaren, and Lando set a time of 1:23.405. During his pole lap in the wet, Lando reached a top speed of 308 km per hour, which is about 191 miles per hour. In the dry sprint race qualifying session, however, teammate Oscar Piastri set the pole lap, and he set a time of 1:08.899. In the Grand Prix itself, the race fastest lap was set by Max Verstappen in the Red Bull, and Verstappen set a time of 1:20.472 because it was wet. If it is dry, then obviously I expect that the pole lap and the race fastest lap will be beaten very, very easily. If it's wet, then it's just a matter of how wet it is. I try to say if you're enjoying the video so far, then I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. But now, let's get back to the video and let's talk about Red Bull. For Red Bull then, the Mexico City Grand Prix didn't go as well as what they or I was expecting. I expected this to be one of their strongest races, but as ever with this season, Red Bull did a good job of making me look silly, as Max Verstappen didn't have the race pace of McLaren. Red Bull introduced a new flaw to their car, but it seemed to affect their balance just a little bit. With a bit more time now to assess what they learned in Mexico, it will be interesting to see if they can find the benefit, and they really have to find it quickly, because for Max Verstappen, while he is still in the hunt for the championship, time is slowly starting to slip away from being on his side. What is on his side, however, is that he is pretty strong at Brazil, and we saw last year just how brilliant he can be if the race is wet. As of now, it is looking to be wet, so we might see some Max Verstappen magic once again. And if we do, then we might just see him bring himself within a race win of taking the lead in the Drivers' Championship. For Mercedes then, they dropped to third in the Constructors' Championship after a relatively tricky weekend based on how the last few weekends have been. Mercedes spent a lot of the race stuck behind the Haas car of Oliver Bearman, as they were looking very strong, but we saw Kimi Antonelli beat George Russell for once. However, for Mercedes, the upcoming race is one where they have been pretty strong recently. Let's not forget, Mercedes' George Russell was leading the race pretty comfortably last season before he had to pit before we saw the red flag. And then of course we saw them win in 2022. With that in mind, we might see a strong race from them again, and Mercedes might move back up to second place in the Constructors' Championship. But they did lose second to Ferrari. And for Ferrari then, we saw a great race and a great race from Charles Leclerc, despite the amount of lift and coast both himself and Lewis Hamilton had to do once again. And we saw Ferrari move up to second place in the Constructors' Championship. Leclerc was able to hold off a much faster Max Verstappen in the Red Bull, despite being on medium tyres that were not really working around the Mexico circuit. Teammate Hamilton had a difficult race after getting a 10-second time penalty, but even with the time penalty, Hamilton's pace was not that fantastic. He did get a little bit of damage, but also we saw some pretty poor tyre wear from Hamilton, especially in the first stint on the soft tyres. But going to Brazil, we are looking at a track where Lewis Hamilton does have a pretty good track record. However, Ferrari themselves don't seem to have the best recent history. They last won the race in 2017, and they got the podium in 2022 with Carlos Sainz, but it's not been great since then. There are rumours that Ferrari may be taking power unit penalties in Brazil, and if this is the case, then to be honest, this is one of the best places to take power unit penalties, because generally it is pretty easy to overtake at this circuit, especially if it is dry. And it does make sense because there's some very power sensitive circuits coming up, such as Las Vegas and Qatar, where they will need all the power unit performance that they can muster. And for Ferrari, we may see them, I think, drop back to third in the Constructors' Championship, regardless of if they do take a power unit penalty. And finally, for McLaren then, it was a dominant performance by Lando Norris, as he won the Grand Prix very, very easily. And with that, Lando Norris has now taken the lead in the Drivers' World Championship by just 1 point from Oscar Piastri. Norris has had a few very strong races now, and he has earned the lead in the championship. Teammate Oscar Piastri, however, has had some very difficult races and difficult results. However, it does have to be said that even based on last year, those were some of Piastri's weaker races. Last year though, during the dry portion of the weekend, Oscar Piastri was actually stronger than Lando Norris in Brazil. Let's not forget, he would have won the sprint race if not for the team call to swap them around. If the weekend is dry this weekend, we may see Oscar Piastri bounce back, But either way for McLaren, they need to ensure that both cars open the gap to Max Verstappen. They are now so close to opening the lead in the championship to a large enough margin that Verstappen might not be able to catch them. But if it is wet, then they will need to be perfect in the wet in order to make sure Verstappen does not capitalise on any mistakes that they may make. So with that in mind then, what are my early predictions for the Brazilian Grand Prix? Well, in the midfield, I think that the top midfield team will be Haas and the top midfield driver will be Oliver Bearman. That is if it's dry. If it's wet, then it's pretty much anyone's guess who will be the top midfield team and driver. But what about pole position in the top 5? Well, for pole position, I'm going to go for Max Verstappen. I think this is a great circuit for Max. He's shown some brilliant performances in the past, and well, I think he's going to get pole once again. But what about the top 5 in the Grand Prix? Well, for P5, I'm going to go for Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari. That is, of course, dependent on the power unit penalty situation. P4, I'm going to go for Oscar Piastri in the McLaren because I do think it might be a bit of a wet race, and Piastri somehow seems to always have some sort of issue in the wet recently. Think of Silverstone and Australia. Of course, Spa did take the lead, but again, that was one result. In P3, I'm going to go for Lando Norris in the McLaren. P2 will be George Russell in the Mercedes because I do think Mercedes are going to go well at Brazil. And that means that, yes, I'm going to go for Max Verstappen to win the Brazilian Grand Prix and bring himself within one race of taking the lead in the Drivers' Championship. But those are my thoughts. The question is, what do you guys think will happen? In the comment section down below, please do let me know. And as always, comment, leave a like and subscribe for more F1 content. Thank you all so much for watching.